Cleveland's underworld ran on one unbroken rule. Nobody kept Emilio Barsanti waiting, and nobody refused him twice. So when his silent one-year-old triplets were wheeled into a diner on the industrial flats that night, it should have been the terrified staff who broke first. Instead, it was a waitress carrying a tray of water glasses who upended everything. A woman who had buried 3 babies of her own 16 months earlier. Or believed she had. She had no reason to think a Mafia Don's children belonged to her grief. Then his son looked up at her and said the one word he had never said to a living soul. Before the night was finished, a stolen line would be handed back, and an empire built on a lie would either crown her its queen or bury her with the truth. Delphine Rourke had learned to tie her apron strings loose because the tight kind cut into her waist by the second hour of a double shift, and doubles were the only kind of shift she took anymore. She was fat, plainly and simply, built soft and heavy through the hips and shoulders, and she wore that body the way some people wear a coat they've stopped noticing, with a quiet indie that had nothing left to prove to anyone. The other girls at the Copper Kettle called her sweet in the tone people use for someone they've already stopped seeing. Delphine had gotten good at not minding it. She had bigger things to survive. 16 months ago, she had woken up in a recovery room at Mercy Lakeside with a paper gown sticking to her skin and a doctor's voice telling her gently that her triplets hadn't made it through the delivery. She'd gone into that pregnancy as a surrogate, one last desperate arrangement to cover the mountain of debt her mother's cancer treatment had left behind, expecting to hand 3 babies to strangers she'd never meet and walk away with just enough money to breathe again. She had told herself she was ready for that goodbye. Nothing had prepared her for the other one. Grief has no patience for the fine print of a contract, and by the time the sedation wore off, she was mourning children she'd never even been allowed to hold. The year after that had blurred into something she only survived one shift at a time. Food became the one comfort that never asked anything of her, and her body had grown the way grief sometimes grows a person, slow and uncomplaining, until the woman in the mirror barely resembled the one who'd walked into Mercy Lakeside 16 months before. She didn't apologize for any of it, not the wait, not the silence, not the empty apartment she came home to every night. She got up. She worked doubles. She counted her tips at the register under fluorescent light and called that a life, because it was the only one she had left, and some stubborn, unkillable part of her still intended to keep it. New stories like Delphine's arrive here every single day, so subscribe and stay close. The bell over the door chimed at 7:40 that Thursday, and the whole dining room changed temperature in the space of a breath. Forks stopped. A woman's laugh died halfway out of her mouth. Paul, the manager, went the color of old dishwater and started moving toward the front before he'd even fully registered why. Emilio Barsanti had walked into his restaurant. Everyone in Cleveland knew the name, even the ones who pretended not to. Barsanti ran the shipping lanes that fed half the black market freight moving out of the Great Lakes, and he ran them with a discipline that had made him rich and feared in roughly equal measure. He was somewhere in his 80s, built like a man who trained out of habit rather than vanity, dark hair combed back, a jaw that looked carved rather than moon, and eyes the flat gray of Erie in November. Tonight, the charcoal cut of his suit did nothing to soften him, and neither did the sight that had every waitress in the building frozen behind the kitchen doors, officers flanking him, and between them, Emilio pushing a wide triple stroller like it was the one thing in his empire he didn't fully know how to control. His wife, Camille, had died in a car fire 6 months earlier, an accident everyone whispered wasn't quite an accident, and it had left him the sole parent of triplets who trusted almost no one. Ansel, Gideon, and Posey were a year old, and by every account, Emilio's men traded in hushed voices. They had gone through a small army of nannies without settling on a single one. Tonight apparently was no different. As Paul led the group to the private booth and back, the three of them erupted into a screaming, red-faced meltdown that no amount of hushing from their father could touch. Back in the kitchen, the other waitresses backed away from the swinging doors like the booth itself might bite them. "Not me," one of them hissed. "I'm not going near that table." Paul grabbed the nearest full tray, which happened to be Delphine's, and shoved it into her hands hard enough to slosh water over the rim. "You're going, Rourke. Nobody else will. You mess this up, upset that man, and you're out before you untie your apron. Go." Delphine's knees ached the way they always did by hour 6, and she pushed through the doors without much fear left in her to spin on a stranger in an expensive suit, no matter how many men stood behind him. She had already survived losing everything once. Whatever waited at that table couldn't touch the worst thing that had ever happened to her. The scene at the booth was worse up close. Little Gideon had hurled his plush bear onto the floor and was screaming with his whole small body. Ansel's face had gone a deep, furious red. He just cried, quiet and defeated, tears sliding down cheeks that hadn't stopped shaking. Emilio sat with his head in one hand, and for just a moment, in the low light of the back booth, the most feared man on the Cleveland docks looked simply, helplessly exhausted. His men stood useless around him, hands twitching near holsters that were no good against 3 crying babies. Delphine set the tray down, bent to retrieve the bear off the floor with more grace than her size usually got credit for, and looked at the 3 of them with the same low, easy voice she used on every overtired toddler who ever came through that diner. "Well now," she said, "that's an awful lot of noise for such beautiful babies. What's got you all so upset tonight?" Gideon stopped crying. His wet hazel eyes locked onto her face and held there. So screaming choked off into a hiccup as he turned to stare at her too. He let out a small, startled gasp and reached both hands over the edge of the stroller, straining toward the waitress like she'd been waiting all night for exactly this. Emilio went still. His hand dropped from his temple. Behind him his men tensed, sensing something even they didn't have a name for. These children didn't do this. They had rejected trained nannies with references a mile long, cousins, aunts, his own housekeeper. They settled for no one but him. Delphine felt the weight of Emilio's stare land on her like a held breath, and suddenly remembered exactly how she looked. Stained apron, tired eyes, a body she'd stopped explaining to anyone. "I'll just get your menu," she managed, stepping back. That was when Gideon reached for her with both fists, opened his mouth, and said the first word of his entire life, loud and clear enough to silence the room around them. Nobody breathed. Ansel pointed a small round finger straight at her chest and took up the word like it belonged to him too. "Mom, Mom." She bounced in her seat, giggling, adding her own bright little voice to the chorus. "Mom, Mom." Emilio rose slowly from the booth, and every ounce of quiet menace he carried seemed to fill the room at once. He looked from his children who had never once spoken, to the frightened waitress standing over them, and something in his face went cold and searching. "What did you do to them?" he said, low enough that it landed like a threat. "Nothing, I swear," Delphine said, backing up another step, heart slamming. "I picked up the toy, that's all. I have never seen these children before in my life." Emilio studied her face like he was reading a document, and what he found stopped him cold. The exact hazel of his children's eyes stared back at him from a stranger's face. The same set to the nose he saw 3 times over every morning at breakfast. A suspicion took root in him that he didn't want and couldn't yet name. "Petra," he said without turning around, and his scarred underboss stepped out of the shadows by the door. "Get her full name. I want her entire life on my desk within the hour." He looked back once more at his children, still straining toward the waitress with the raw, desperate want of infants reaching for something they recognized in their bones, and then he turned and walked out into the night. The doors of Emilio's private office in the compound above the harbor shut with a heavy, final sound an hour later, sealing him inside with a glass of whiskey he hadn't touched. Cleveland's skyline glittered beyond the window, indifferent to the storm going on in his head. He could not stop replaying the sight of his children, guarded and untouchable with everyone alive except him, reaching for a total stranger and calling her theirs. Petra came in with a thick folder under her arm, the kind of thick that told him before she said a word that whatever she'd found, he wasn't going to like it. "You have it," Emilio said, voice deceptively even. "Everything, boss," Petra answered, setting the file on his desk. "And you're not going to like the shape of it." Took some digging into sealed medical records, but the timeline doesn't lie. He opened the folder. The first page was a photograph of a woman who looked hollowed out, eyes empty of anything like hope. Delphine Rourke, 29, clean record, drowning in medical debt from a mother's cancer treatment. It was the second page that stopped his breath in his chest. 16 months earlier, she had been admitted to Mercy Lakeside, heavily pregnant with triplets. Buried deep in the clinic's encrypted files, Petra had found what Emilio least expected to see. 3 death certificates, all signed by the hospital's chief of obstetrics, a man named Dr. Aurelio Vance. She was told her babies died during delivery, Petra said quietly, watching the color drain from her boss's face and something far worse rise up behind it. "I pulled the morgue intake logs for that month. No infants were ever processed. Not one." Emilio's hand closed around the folder until the paper crumpled under his fingers. His mind went, unwillingly, to his late wife. Camille had despised the idea of pregnancy the way she despised anything that threatened the careful architecture of her own beauty. And when she'd announced 16 months ago that she was expecting, she had also announced, in the same breath, that she needed to disappear to a private wellness retreat in the Alps for the duration. Emilio had been buried in a brutal territory dispute at the time and had let her go, trusting her the way a fool trusts a viper because it shared his bed for years. Camille had come home 9 months later, slim as the day he'd married her, carrying 3 newborns in her arms. "If she's got you leaning forward already, subscribe before the next twist lands." "She never carried them," Emilio said, the words arriving like a physical blow. "She bought them." "It gets worse," Petra said. 2 days after Delphine Rourke delivered, an offshore account tied to Camille moved $3.5 million into a trust controlled by Dr. Vance. A silence settled over Emilio, colder than anything he'd felt in 15 years running this territory. His entire family, the whole architecture of his life since Ansel, Gideon, and Bosie had drawn their first breaths, had been built on the theft of another woman's children and the manufactured grief of a stranger who had done nothing wrong. Camille had paid a corrupted doctor to steal babies from a woman with no one left to fight for her, and Delphine had spent 16 months burying children who were, at that very hour, asleep in custom cribs inside his own house. "Bring the car around," Emilio said, and his voice had gone past anger into something with no temperature at all. "We're paying Dr. Vance a visit." 20 minutes later, Emilio walked through the bright, sterile corridors of Mercy Lakeside without raising his voice once, because men like him never had to. He pushed past a protesting receptionist, let himself into Dr. Vance's private consulting room, locked the door, lowered the blinds, and set a silenced pistol on the desk between them without a word. Vance was a man whose confidence had always run on wealthy patients and a country club membership, and it evaporated the instant he saw the weapon. Within minutes, he was sobbing out the whole story. Camille had come to him and demanded he find her a woman desperate enough, poor enough, alone enough to disappear into a story about a tragic delivery. When Delphine came in to give birth, Vance had sedated her past the point of memory, taken the infants, falsified the paperwork, and handed all three over to Camille's private security in the parking structure below. She was drowning in debt. Vance wept, shaking so hard his chair rattled against the floor. Camille said she was giving those children a better life. She said it like she believed it. Emilio picked his weapon back up off the desk and slid it into his jacket with unhurried precision. "You have exactly 1 hour to be out of this city," he said, quiet as a blade drawn from its sheath. "If any of my people ever see your face in Cleveland again, I will not be half this forgiving." He left the doctor sobbing behind his own locked door and walked out of the hospital with something aching hard in his chest that had nothing to do with anger anymore. He thought about Delphine, exhausted and mocked and grieved, a lie manufactured by his own dead wife, working double shifts to survive a wound she never should have carried in the first place. "Take me to the restaurant," he told his driver before the door had even shut behind him. By the time the SUV pulled into the alley behind the Copper Kettle, the sky had opened into a hard, freezing rain. Emilio stepped out without bothering to raise his collar against it. There, folded onto an overturned milk crate by the dumpsters, sat Delphine, apron gone, shoulders shaking with the kind of crying that comes from somewhere much older than whatever started it tonight. Paul had made good on his threat. She'd been fired before she even got her coat. Emilio stopped a few feet away, something in his chest twisting at the sight of her. Discarded by a world that had never once looked closely enough to see what it was throwing away. This woman, humiliated and worked half to death just to survive her own grief, was the true mother of his children, the one who had given them life while his dead wife built a monument of lies on top of her loss. He crossed the last few feet of wet pavement, leather shoes splitting the puddles, the sound cutting clean through the rain. Delphine looked up, face raw and streaked, and froze at the sight of the most feared man in the city standing over her. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't threaten her. He shrugged out of his soaked suit jacket and settled it gently over her shivering shoulders instead. "Come with me," he said, and something in his voice had gone soft in a way she wouldn't have believed an hour ago. "It's time you went home to your children." The drive out to the Barsanti compound passed in a silence too heavy to break. Delphine sat rigid in the leather seat, Emilio's jacket still draped over her. Some reckless spark of hope fighting its way up through 16 months of grief, despite every instinct telling her not to trust it. Rain streaked the windows, smearing the city's lights into long gold ribbons as they left downtown behind for the guarded hills above the lake. When the compound's iron gates finally swung open, Delphine actually gasped. The place was a fortress of stone and glass, high walls, armed men patrolling a perimeter that seemed to go on forever. Inside, marble stairs swept up beneath a chandelier the size of her old apartment, and for a moment she felt the full, dizzying distance between the life she'd been surviving and whatever this was. Get her dry clothes, East Wing, Emilio told a stern older woman who appeared at the top of the stairs, a housekeeper named Vanessa, who looked Delphine over once with an expression that gave nothing away. Then his eyes came back to Delphine. Change. Then come find me in my study. There's a great deal you need to hear. 10 minutes later, dressed in soft, oversized silk that draped easily over her wide hips and shoulders, Delphine was led into a old room where a fire threw long shadows across Emilio's face. He gestured her toward a deep velvet chair. I don't waste time softening the truth, Delphine, he began, voice low and even, the kind of steady that made the room feel smaller. And what I found out tonight is ugly. He set the thick folder down on the table between them. With a patience that felt almost surgical, he laid the whole thing out. His late wife, terrified of what pregnancy would do to the body she'd built her identity around, had orchestrated an act of theft so total, it barely had a name. He explained Dr. Vance's role, the falsified certificate, the 16 months Delphine had spent grieving children who were, that very hour, asleep 2 floors above them. You went to Vance's clinic for a paid surrogacy arrangement to cover your mother's medical bills, Emilio said, watching every line of devastation cross her face. Camille manipulated the whole process. She made sure the arrangement used my line, and what she told everyone was a donor egg. But Petra dug deeper into the clinic's sealed files, and there's a second truth under the first one. There was no donor. Camille used yours. She wanted the appearance of an heir for my family without carrying one herself. You are their mother, not a surrogate, their actual biological mother. Delphine couldn't get air to her lungs. The room tilted. Everything that had defined the last 16 months of her life, the grief that had rebuilt her body and hollowed out her knees, had been built on a foundation of someone else's cruelty. My babies, she whispered, tears sliding freely now. They're mine. They're yours, Emilio said softly. She was on her feet before she'd decided to move. Every ounce of fear she might have carried for the dangerous man in front of her burned away by the one thing that mattered more, getting to her children. He read the look on her face and simply led her up the staircase without a word, toward a nursery guarded like a vault. Inside, 3 custom cribs stood in a row under low light. Delphine crossed to the first one on legs that barely held her. Gideon slept soundly, his small chest rising and falling. Beside him, Ansel had curled around his plush bear. Last was Posy, one small hand pressed flat against the crib's wooden slats. Delphine sank to her knees in the middle of the room, her whole heavy frame shaking with silent sobs, grieving a lost year and rejoicing over a found one in the same breath. The sound of her crying stirred Gideon awake. He pulled himself up against the rail, rubbing his eyes, and the second he saw her, his whole face opened into recognition. Mom, he said happily, arms already reaching through the bars. Delphine lifted him and pressed his warm cheek to hers, breathing him in like air, after drowning. Ansel and Posy woke seconds later, adding their voices to his, 3 small bodies straining toward the one person their instincts had known before their minds ever caught up. Emilio stood in the doorway watching, and a man who hadn't let much move him in years felt the ground shift under him for good. He had spent his adult life around women who were polished, calculated, cold, women like Camille, who wore beauty like armor and warmth like a costume they could take off. Delphine knelt on his nursery floor carrying a body that told the true story of everything she'd survived, and he found her more devastating than any woman he'd ever let close. She wasn't built like the world around him. She was real, worn honest by grief, and fiercely, unmistakably beautiful, in a way none of that world had prepared him to want. "You will never set foot back in that diner," Emilio said, stepping into the room and resting a hand on her shoulder. "No landlord, no unpaid, no manager who fires you for surviving a bad night. None of it touches you again. This is your home now." Delphine looked up at him, giddy and both clinging to her chest. "I'm not built for a world like yours, Emilio. I'm a waitress." "You're the mother of my children," he said, and there was nothing in his voice that left room for argument. "And from tonight forward, you're under my protection, completely." 3 weeks passed, and the change inside the Barsanti compound was almost impossible to describe to anyone who hadn't watched it happen. The house that had gone quiet and cold since Camille's death filled again with noise, real noise, the triplets laughing down marble hallways, the industrial kitchen smelling like something home-cooked instead of catered. Delphine refused to let the staff hover in corners and insisted on cooking herself most nights. Emilio started leaving business meetings early, telling himself it was to check on the children, and knowing every time that it was mostly to see her. He loved the soft weight of her waist under his hand when they brushed past each other in the kitchen. He loved the flush that crept up her cheeks when she caught him watching her sing to the babies. For the first time and longer than he wanted to admit, the most feared man on the Cleveland docks felt almost peaceful. Peace never lasted long in Emilio's world, and this time the threat wasn't a rival crew. It came from inside his own blood. Silas Barsanti, Emilio's cousin, had spent years circling the idea that the throne should have gone to him instead, and Emilio's sudden softness disgusted him in a way he could barely contain. When Silas learned the truth, that Camille had faked an entire pregnancy, and that the woman now running the household was a plus-size waitress with no name in their world, he saw the opening he'd been waiting for. If the triplets could be painted as illegitimate and Emilio removed from the picture entirely, the whole territory would fall into Silas's hands without a fight. It happened on a Tuesday. Emilio had been held up at the docks past midnight, leaving the house under a thinner shift of security than usual. Delphine was in the nursery, rocking Posy through the last stubborn minutes before sleep, when the quiet of the house cracked apart under the sound of automatic gunfire downstairs. Red emergency lights began strobing through the hallway a heartbeat later. Petra burst into the nursery, jacket torn, face gone gray. Silas's men breached the outer gate. "We're outnumbered down there. Delphine, you need to move the children right now." Something purely maternal took over, steady and clear-eyed where panic should have been. Delphine grabbed the reinforced duffel Emilio had made her keep packed for exactly this, loaded all 3 crying toddlers inside, and zipped it just far enough that they could still breathe. "Panic rooms in the basement," Petra said, over the sound of boots pounding up the marble stairs. "I'll hold them here as long as I can." "No," Delphine said, and her voice came out steadier than she felt. "Silas helped design that security grid," Emilio told me. "They'll know exactly where to look." She hauled the duffel over one shoulder, the same wide, strong frame she'd spent a lifetime apologizing for, now the only thing standing between her children and a stairwell full of... "We take the roof access." She moved faster than anyone watching would have guessed, cutting through the service cord just as Silas's men kicked the nursery door in behind them. They reached the heavy steel door to the roof, and Delphine shoved the children through into the cold night air. As she turned to follow, an enforcer stepped out of the stairwell and raised his weapon on Petra. Delphine didn't think. She threw her whole weight forward. driving her shoulder into his chest like a battering ram, and the force of it sent him tumbling backward down the concrete stairs with a crack that echoed off the walls. A slow metallic click sounded behind her. She turned to find Silas standing there, weapon leveled at her chest, a thin, satisfied smile on his face. "Look at you," he said, eyes crawling over her with open contempt. Emilio's new prize. A heavy little waitress playing house in a mansion. Camille was a monster, but at least she looked the part sitting on that throne. "Step aside, and maybe I let you run." Delphine didn't move an inch. She squared her shoulders in the doorway, blocking the only way to her children, eyes burning with the flat calm of a woman who had nothing left to lose. "You'll have to go through me," she said, low and even. "And I promise you, I am not going quietly." Silas thinned. His finger tightened against the trigger. "Silas." The voice that tore down the hallway didn't sound entirely human. Emilio stood at the far end, a dozen of his own men behind him, soaked from the rain outside, his fury gone quiet and lethal. Silas barely had time to turn his head before Emilio raised his weapon and fired once. Silas dropped where he stood, and the true head of the family stood over him, breathing hard. The silence afterward felt enormous. Emilio let the gun fall from his hand and crossed the distance to Delphine at a run, wrapping his arms fully around her shaking body, face buried in her neck. "I have you," he said, voice cracking open in a way she'd never heard from him. "I have you. You're safe." Delphine wrapped her arms around his shoulders and let the adrenaline finally drain out of her, replaced by a steadiness that felt like it might actually stay this time. By morning, the syndicate had been completely purged of the last of Silas's people. But that wasn't the part Emilio cared about anymore. Sitting in the sunlit dining room, Delphine fed Ansel a spoonful of oatmeal while Bosie hurled a piece of toast directly at Emilio's head. He caught it without even looking, eyes locked on Delphine the whole time, taking in the soft curve of her stomach against the table, the color back in her cheeks, the sheer, settled confidence she carried now that had nothing left to apologize for. She wasn't the exhausted woman in the stained apron anymore. She was Delphine Barsanti, matriarch of an empire that had nearly destroyed itself, trying to hide the truth about where it began. Gideon pointed a sticky finger at her from his high chair and said it again, bright and certain. "Mom." Emilio watched her laugh and thought simply that his family was finally whole. If her story pulled you in, subscribe now. A new one lands here tomorrow.